Long Island, New York, a place that, for most children, would have been filled with playground laughter, ice cream trucks, and the comfort of family dinners. But for Christine Paolilla, it began as a fragile and fractured world. She was barely 4 when her father, a construction worker, suffered a fatal accident on the job. One moment he was a towering figure of strength in her young eyes, the next he was gone, replaced by whispers of condolences and a mother struggling to keep the family afloat. Death came early into Christine's life, and with it, a cold lesson in how easily the ground beneath you can give way. As if that loss wasn't enough, fate struck again in the form of illness. Christine was diagnosed with a rare condition that impaired her vision. Her eyes could no longer capture the world clearly, everything became a blur of shapes and shadows. Thick, oversized glasses became her constant companion. For a child desperate to fit in, they were a cruel spotlight, drawing the attention of school bullies who had no mercy for weakness. They called her names, snatched her glasses to taunt her, and laughed when she stumbled into desks or lockers. Each jeer carved a scar, invisible yet deep, on the fragile walls of her self-worth. Christine learned early on to keep her head down, to stay small and unnoticed. But being invisible came with its own kind of pain, loneliness that wrapped around her like a winter coat she couldn't take off. Her mother tried to hold the family together, but the weight of grief and single parenthood showed in the quiet moments, in the way she stared at unpaid bills or sighed when she thought no one was listening. When Christine's mother eventually remarried, there was a shift. It wasn't a fairy tale transformation, it was simply a new chapter with different scenery. The family packed up and moved to Clear Lake, Texas, a suburban town with sun-baked streets, manicured lawns, and a high school that pulsed with the usual teenage dramas: sports teams, cliques, whispered crushes, and unspoken hierarchies. For Christine, it was a chance to start over. Or so she hoped. The first weeks at Clear Lake High were anything but magical. Her thick glasses still drew stares, her shyness made her an easy target for whispers, and she found herself eating lunch alone more often than not. She would watch the bustling cafeteria, the jocks at their table, the cheerleaders laughing loudly, the band kids huddled over sheet music, and feel the ache of wanting to belong. She was just the new girl, and not the kind anyone was in a hurry to know. Then came the day she met Rachel Colorudis. It happened in the hallway between classes. Rachel, with her bright smile and easy charm, noticed Christine struggling to gather her dropped books. Instead of stepping over her like so many others would, Rachel crouched down, handed them back, and said something so simple yet so foreign to Christine. "Hey, I'm Rachel. You should sit with us at lunch." It wasn't just kindness, it was an invitation into a different world. That lunch table was where Christine also met Tiffany Rowell. Tiffany had a magnetic energy, confident, effortlessly stylish, and popular without the cruelty that sometimes came with it. Together, Rachel and Tiffany were the kind of girls who could have ignored her, who could have let her remain invisible. But they didn't. It started small. Compliments on her hair, a suggestion to try a different style of makeup, a shared inside joke. Then one Saturday they invited Christine to Tiffany's house. The two girls turned it into a full-blown makeover session, curling her hair, swapping her thick glasses for contact lenses, showing her how to apply eyeliner without smudging it. Christine barely recognized herself in the mirror. For the first time, she wasn't the awkward girl with the thick glasses. She was someone who could blend in, maybe even stand out. School on Monday was different. People looked at her, really looked at her. Some in surprise, others with curiosity. A few boys who had never spoken to her before asked her name. The makeover had been more than just physical. It was a shift in how she carried herself. She walked taller, smiled more, dared to speak up in class. And always, Rachel and Tiffany were there, guiding her into this new version of herself. Christine had never had friends like this before. Friends who included her in plans, who whispered secrets to her in the hall, who made her feel like she was part of something. She started spending most of her afternoons with them, hanging out at the mall, trying on clothes, sipping milkshakes at the food court. In the bubble of their friendship, she felt safe, valued, even loved. But underneath the glow of this transformation was something else, something quieter and harder to name. Christine began to fear losing this newfound acceptance. She had been on the outside for so long that she knew exactly how cold it was out there, and she never wanted to go back. So she adapted herself to fit more and more into their world. If they liked a certain band, so did she. If they hated a certain classmate, she kept her distance too. If they skipped class, she followed. Her grades slipped, but she didn't care. The warmth of belonging was worth more than any letter on a report card. Her mother noticed the changes, worried aloud about the makeup, the late nights, the new attitude. Christine brushed it off. How could her mother understand? She wasn't losing her daughter, Christine told herself. She was simply becoming who she was meant to be. Yet even as life seemed to brighten, shadows lingered at the edges. Christine's insecurities didn't vanish. They simply hid beneath new clothes and eyeliner. Every time she caught a glance of herself without makeup, the old Christine stared back, the one who had been mocked and overlooked. That girl was still there, whispering doubts into her mind. And deep down, Christine knew that if Rachel and Tiffany ever turned away from her, she'd fall harder than she ever had before. For now, though, everything felt perfect. She had friends who defended her, a social life she'd only dreamed of, and a mirror that reflected a girl she could almost believe in. She didn't know it yet, but this friendship, this golden, glittering chapter, would become the center of everything. It would lift her to heights she'd never imagined, and then just as quickly drag her into darkness so deep that there would be no way back. The girl next door had finally found her place. But sometimes the place you think you belong is the one that will destroy you. Christine Paolilla's metamorphosis was nothing short of cinematic. The once awkward girl with oversized glasses and a hesitant smile was gone, replaced by a confident young woman with striking hazel eyes framed by contact lenses, hairstyle to perfection, and clothes that mirrored the effortless chic of her newfound friends. The makeover, orchestrated by Rachel Colorudis and Tiffany Rowell, didn't just change Christine's appearance, it rewrote her entire social script. By the start of her senior year, whispers followed her in the school hallways, but they were no longer mocking. Admiration replaced ridicule, and for the first time, Christine felt the intoxicating rush of being noticed for the right reasons. When the school crowned her Miss Irresistible, the title carried symbolic weight. For her, it was more than a crown, it was proof that she had outrun the ghosts of her childhood, that the bullied little girl from Long Island was gone forever. But while her outer shell gleamed, the inside still bore cracks. In quiet moments, alone in her room or walking home after a night out, Christine could feel the old insecurities breathing down her neck. The fear of rejection hadn't disappeared, it had only been dressed in designer labels and hidden behind a confident smile. It was a secret she guarded closely, because the fragile scaffolding of her self-esteem depended on everyone believing she had it all together. It was around this time that Christopher Snider entered her life. He was older, edgier, and carried himself with the kind of self-assured defiance that drew her in. His dark hair fell in messy waves over a brooding face, and his sly smile hinted at danger. Rumors swirled about his criminal background, petty theft, drugs, fights, but that only seemed to make him more magnetic in Christine's eyes. They met at a small gathering one Friday night, a humid Texas evening when the air seemed to hum with possibility. He approached her with a casual swagger, striking up conversation as if they'd known each other for years. Christine found herself laughing at his sarcastic humor, hanging on to every story he told, stories that blurred the line between bragging and confession. That night, when he offered her a ride home, she didn't hesitate. From then on, they were inseparable. Christopher's presence in her life was intoxicating, the way a forbidden fruit tempts with its sweetness and its danger. He told her she was beautiful without the makeup, that she was stronger than she realized, that no one could hurt her as long as he was around. Christine, who had long craved protection and validation, absorbed his words like they were gospel. But the relationship began to reshape her world in ways her friends noticed immediately. Rachel and Tiffany, once the center of her social orbit, found her pulling away. Invitations to hang out were declined with vague excuses. Lunches at school were skipped or spent at the far edge of the parking lot, where Christopher's car idled with the radio playing low. Christine's laughter, once bright and easy, now carried a sharper edge like she was on guard. Snider didn't like Rachel and Tiffany. He said they were fake, that they looked down on her, that they'd drop her the second someone more interesting came along. His words planted seeds of doubt that Christine couldn't quite shake. After all, wasn't he the one who saw her worth before anyone else did? Her mother noticed the change too. Christine's once vibrant energy at home was replaced by long hours shut in her room, hushed phone calls, and a growing defiance toward house rules. Arguments erupted over curfews, skipped classes, and the way Christopher seemed to consume all of her time. But every criticism from her mother only pushed Christine closer to him. He made her feel like it was them against the world. By the middle of the school year, Christine's social transformation had reached its peak, but it came with a cost. The Miss Irresistible crown still sat proudly on her dresser, but it had started to feel like a relic from a different life. Now, her confidence was tethered to Christopher's approval. When he was in a good mood, she felt unstoppable. When he was cold or angry, she felt herself spiraling into the same insecurity she thought she had escaped. There were moments when Christopher's temper flared, slamming doors, harsh words, long silences, but he always found a way to make her believe it was her fault or that it came from a place of love. Christine convinced herself she could handle it. After all, she had handled worse in the past. Her old friends watched from the sidelines, uneasy. They didn't recognize the girl who used to light up at the simplest things, singing along to pop songs in Rachel's car, late-night runs for ice cream, sharing secrets at sleepovers. Now, Christine's smiles were rarer, and when they appeared, they often seemed forced. The tension between her old world and her new one deepened. A few arguments with Rachel ended in cold silences, while Tiffany simply drifted away, hurt by the distance that had grown between them. The bonds that once felt unbreakable now seemed fragile, and Christine wasn't sure if she wanted to repair them, or if she even could. But she didn't realize that this isolation was exactly where Christopher wanted her. The more she leaned on him, the more control he had. And the more control he had, the easier it was to steer her away from anything, or anyone, that might challenge his influence. By spring, the picture-perfect version of Christine's senior year had begun to blur at the edges. The glamour of her transformation was still visible to outsiders, but behind closed doors, cracks were spreading through the foundation. Christopher's world, dangerous, unpredictable, and consuming, was starting to replace her own. Every choice she made, every step she took, was pulling her deeper into his orbit. And while Christine couldn't see it yet, that orbit was leading her down a path from which there would be no return. It was a shift so gradual that she barely noticed it happening, how she had stopped calling Rachel back, how she no longer cared about grades, how the thrill of rebellion began to outweigh the satisfaction of playing by the rules. Christopher was her anchor now, even if that anchor was dragging her into darker waters. The girl next door was gone. In her place stood someone who was willing to risk everything for the rush of belonging to someone who made her feel seen. Someone who also happened to carry chaos in his back pocket. And chaos was coming. By mid-2003, the friendship between Christine, Rachel, and Tiffany had begun to unravel. What once was a strong and inseparable bond among the three girls started to show signs of strain. The underlying cause of this tension was Christine's growing association with Snider, a figure that Rachel and Tiffany found deeply troubling. Their disapproval of Snider grew stronger with each passing day, and they began warning Christine about his manipulative and dangerous nature. Despite their concerns, Christine's loyalty to Snider only intensified, creating a wedge between her and her longtime friends. Rachel and Tiffany were not blind to the changes in Christine. They saw how Snider's presence altered her behavior, how she became more withdrawn and defensive. Their warnings about Snider's intentions were motivated by genuine concern, but Christine viewed their interventions as attacks. She believed that her friends were misunderstanding the situation and unfairly judging Snider. This difference in perception caused arguments to erupt, increasing the distance between the girls. Christine started to feel isolated and betrayed. The sense of abandonment by Rachel and Tiffany weighed heavily on her. She questioned their loyalty and wondered why they could not accept the changes in her life. At the same time, Snider's influence over Christine was growing stronger. He played on her fears and insecurities, convincing her that Rachel and Tiffany were spreading false rumors and plotting to embarrass her. This manipulation deepened Christine's paranoia and fueled her growing distrust of her former friends. As the tensions escalated, the once close-knit group experienced escalating conflicts. Conversations that used to be warm and friendly became confrontational. The girls, who had shared so many memories together, now found themselves at odds. The emotional toll on Christine was significant. She felt her stability slipping away as she struggled to navigate the growing hostility around her. Snider positioned himself as Christine's protector, the only person who truly had her back. Whenever Christine felt vulnerable or rejected, Snider was there to reinforce the narrative that her former friends were enemies. This dynamic made Christine increasingly dependent on him, weakening her ability to make clear judgments. The emotional bond she shared with Rachel and Tiffany was overshadowed by Snider's control and the growing suspicion he instilled. The fractures in the friendship went beyond surface disagreements. Deep-seated resentment and hostility began to define their interactions. The trust that had once been the foundation of their relationship was replaced by suspicion and bitterness. For Christine, the world she once knew was shrinking. Her social circle narrowed as she withdrew from those who cared for her, further entrenching herself in Snider's influence. Outside observers noticed the shift as well. Mutual friends took sides and the gossip mill began to churn. Rumors and half-truths spread rapidly, often exacerbated by misunderstandings and deliberate provocations. Christine found herself increasingly alienated, caught in a web of mistrust and isolation. The social fabric that had supported her was unraveling quickly. Despite the growing chaos, Christine clung tightly to her relationship with Snider. She overlooked warning signs and rationalized his controlling behavior as care and concern. This misplaced trust laid the groundwork for the choices she would make in the months ahead. Her emotional fragility left her vulnerable to Snider's influence, which was steadily steering her away from her former life. The contrast between the past and present was stark. What had been a vibrant friendship filled with shared dreams and support was now a fractured connection, fragile and fraught with tension. Christine's emotional decline was evident to those around her, though few could intervene effectively. The damage inflicted by the breakdown of trust and the rise of manipulation was already deep. Over time, the attempts at reconciliation grew fewer and farther between. Every effort to mend the broken bonds was met with suspicion or outright rejection. The gap between the girls widened, making a return to the past friendship increasingly unlikely. Christine's dependence on Snider solidified, locking her into a toxic dynamic that isolated her further. This fractured friendship was more than just personal conflict. It was a turning point. It set the stage for a series of events that would have profound consequences. The betrayal and alienation that Christine experienced marked the beginning of a dark chapter in her life, one shaped by deception and loss. Beneath the surface, resentment simmered quietly. The anger and disappointment felt by all parties lingered, unresolved and festering. The emotional wounds were raw and healing seemed out of reach. Christine's world had irrevocably changed, shaped by the forces that tore her friendship apart. Looking ahead, the effects of this broken friendship would ripple far beyond the immediate circle. It was a cautionary tale about the dangers of manipulation and the fragility of trust. Christine's story became a somber reminder of how easily relationships can fracture when fear and control replace understanding and loyalty. The tension that marked this period was a harbinger of the challenges to come. As Christine's isolation deepened, the consequences of her choices would become increasingly apparent. The path she was on was fraught with peril, shaped by the broken ties that once defined her life. In the chapters that followed, the story of Christine's fractured friendship would continue to unfold, revealing the full extent of its impact. The dynamics of trust, betrayal, and control would take center stage, shaping her fate in unexpected ways. The once unbreakable bond was now a shadow of its former self, setting the tone for the tragic events that lay ahead. On the morning of July 18, 2003, the town of Clear Lake, Iowa, seemed like any other quiet summer day. The air was still, and neighbors went about their routines, unaware that this day would soon be marked by tragedy. At Tiffany Rowell's modest home on the outskirts of town, the stage was set for an event that would shock the entire community and change lives forever. Christine and Snider arrived at Tiffany's house in the early afternoon. Their visit seemed ordinary enough at first, with no indication that violence would soon erupt. Inside, Tiffany was with her longtime friend Rachel, and the atmosphere was casual. Also present were Tiffany's boyfriend, Marcus Purcella, and Marcus's cousin, Adalbert Sanchez. The five individuals represented a mix of close relationships. Friends and family gathered together, unaware of the danger approaching. Witnesses in the neighborhood reported hearing nothing unusual in the minutes leading up to the horrific events. There was no sign of disturbance or conflict outside the home. The door was unlocked and there was no evidence of forced entry. This detail would later prove crucial in understanding the nature of the crime. It suggested that the victims had willingly allowed the visitors inside, indicating familiarity and trust. Inside the house, however, events took a dark and violent turn. Within minutes of Christine and Snider's arrival, a series of gunshots shattered the calm. The sounds were rapid and chaotic, multiple rounds fired, echoing through the rooms. The neighbors who heard the shots would later describe them as terrifying and relentless. When law enforcement officers arrived at the scene, they found a grisly tableau. 4 bodies lay lifeless in the home. Tiffany, Rachel, Marcus, and Adalbert had all been shot and killed. The scene was marked by chaos and violence. Bullet casings littered the floors in every room, and signs of struggle were evident. Furniture was overturned, and marks on the walls and floors suggested a desperate attempt to resist the attack. The brutality of the killings was unmistakable. Each victim bore multiple gunshot wounds, indicating a calculated and merciless assault. The nature of the wounds and the placement of the victims suggested that the murders were not random acts of violence but rather deeply personal attacks. The level of violence implied strong emotions, anger, betrayal, or revenge, that fueled the crime. For the police, the investigation began with numerous questions. The lack of forced entry narrowed the suspect list to those who knew the victims and had access to the home. Yet, despite this, initial leads were scarce. The community was stunned by the sudden loss, and fear began to ripple through the small town. Who could commit such a crime and why? Detectives combed through the house, meticulously gathering evidence. They cataloged every bullet casing, photographed the positions of the bodies, and searched for clues that might explain the motive. The disarray inside the home suggested a violent confrontation, but what triggered it remained unclear. Neighbors described the victims in shocked disbelief. Tiffany and Rachel were known locally for their friendly nature, and Marcus and Adalbert were considered respectful members of the community. The killings shattered the sense of security and trust that had existed in Clear Lake, leaving residents searching for answers. As the investigation unfolded, attention quickly turned to Christine and Snider. Both had been seen entering the home shortly before the murders, and their relationships with the victims were scrutinized. The police began to explore the possibility that the killings stemmed from personal conflicts rather than random violence. Christine's recent fractured friendships with Tiffany and Rachel added weight to this theory. The animosity that had developed over the preceding months raised questions about her potential involvement or knowledge of the events. Snider's role was also examined closely, especially given his influence over Christine and the possibility that he might have been involved in planning or executing the attack. Forensic analysis played a crucial role in piecing together the timeline and details of the murders. Ballistics experts matched bullet casings to the weapons used, while investigators reconstructed the sequence of events inside the house. The evidence painted a picture of a violent confrontation that escalated rapidly. Despite the growing body of evidence, the investigation faced challenges. The community's shock and fear complicated witness cooperation, and some potential informants were reluctant to come forward. The emotional impact of the crime weighed heavily on the police force, who were determined to bring justice to the victims. As days turned into weeks, the story began to take shape. The personal nature of the killings became more apparent, and the connections between the suspects and victims were examined in detail. Motives rooted in jealousy, betrayal, and manipulation surfaced as potential explanations for the murders. The police worked tirelessly to untangle the web of relationships and conflicts that surrounded the victims. Each piece of evidence brought them closer to understanding the tragic events of that day. The investigation revealed a narrative far more complex than initially imagined. For the people of Clear Lake, the murders left a lasting scar. The sense of safety that had once defined their community was shattered. Memorials and vigils were held in honor of the victims, and support poured in for their families. The tragedy sparked conversations about trust, loyalty, and the hidden dangers that can lurk beneath the surface of familiar relationships. Behind closed doors, the ramifications of that day would continue to unfold. Christine and Snider's involvement would become a focal point, with authorities piecing together their actions and motivations. The events of July 18, 2003, marked a turning point, one that would lead to a deeper exploration of the dark forces that had fractured friendships and led to devastating loss. As the investigation pressed forward, the community braced itself for the difficult truths that would emerge. The once quiet streets of Clear Lake had become the backdrop for a chilling story of violence, betrayal, and the unraveling of trust. The day of the murders was only the beginning of a long and painful journey toward justice. The brutal murders that had rattled the small community of Clear Lake lingered in the memories of its residents, yet for nearly 3 years the case remained unsolved. Despite the relentless efforts of local law enforcement, the investigation seemed to stall, caught in a web of missing leads and elusive evidence. The search for answers slowed to a frustrating halt, leaving families devastated and justice delayed. In the aftermath, Christine tried to move on with her life. After graduating from high school, she married another man and started a family, seemingly embracing the opportunity for a fresh start. To the outside world, her life appeared stable, a new chapter written over the tragic past. But beneath the surface, Christine was struggling to keep the weight of her secret from overwhelming her. The silence surrounding the case was deafening. Investigators occasionally received tips from the public, but none provided a clear path forward. The trail had grown cold. Every lead seemed to fizzle, leaving police no closer to uncovering the truth. The case was filed away among many unsolved homicides, its pages gathering dust while the victims' families waited in agonizing uncertainty. Christine's mental health began to deteriorate significantly during these years. The psychological strain of living with the secret, coupled with guilt and unresolved trauma, led her down a dark path. Anxiety and depression took root, clouding her thoughts and actions. She became withdrawn and distant, unable to share the burden or find relief. The facade of normalcy she presented was fragile, barely concealing the turmoil inside. Her marriage began to suffer under the weight of these pressures. The man she had married was unaware of the hidden shadows darkening Christine's mind. Financial struggles compounded their problems, and communication between the two grew strained. The relationship, once a source of hope and stability, started to unravel. Arguments became more frequent, and the emotional distance widened. Desperation and pain pushed Christine toward substance abuse. Drugs offered a temporary escape from her spiraling mental health issues and the crushing guilt she carried. What started as a way to numb the pain soon became a destructive addiction. The dependency deepened her problems, affecting her physical health, relationships, and daily functioning. The cycle of addiction fed on her isolation and despair. Financial instability further worsened her situation. With limited income and mounting expenses, she struggled to provide for her family. Bills piled up, and the stress of financial hardship added to the overwhelming challenges she faced. Without a strong support network, Christine's options were limited. The pressure to maintain appearances despite her crumbling reality only intensified. Throughout these years, Christine kept her involvement in the murders a secret. Fear of exposure and the consequences that would follow kept her silent. The secret shaped every aspect of her life, influencing her decisions and interactions. The burden isolated her emotionally, cutting her off from those who might have offered help. The families of the victims endured years of painful uncertainty. Their grief was compounded by the lack of answers and the slow pace of justice. Memorials and anniversaries served as stark reminders of their loss. Despite the passage of time, the wounds remained fresh, and the desire for closure never waned. Law enforcement remained committed to solving the case. Detectives revisited evidence when possible, monitored tips, and held on to hope for breakthroughs. Advances in forensic technology offered potential avenues for progress. The investigation was never forgotten, even as years slipped by without resolution. Christine's social world contracted as she withdrew further into herself. Friends and family reached out but were often met with silence or deflection. The walls she built around herself grew higher, protecting her secret but deepening her loneliness. The psychological isolation fed into the downward spiral she was caught in. Amid the darkness, there were brief moments when Christine sought help. Therapy sessions and rehabilitation attempts hinted at her desire to recover and rebuild. These attempts were often undermined by the weight of her past and the grip of addiction, but they revealed a glimpse of resilience beneath the pain. Nearly 3 years of silence set the stage for the eventual breaking point. The secret Christine kept was no longer sustainable. The slow but steady progress of the investigation began to close in, threatening to unravel the fragile life she had tried to construct. Renewed attention to the case brought new leads and a re-evaluation of old evidence. Law enforcement intensified efforts to connect the dots, examining relationships and motives with fresh eyes. The community braced itself as the possibility of answers grew closer. For the victims' families, hope was rekindled. The long wait for justice seemed poised to end, promising answers to the questions that had haunted them. Their resilience and perseverance underscored the profound impact the murders had left on their lives. Christine's years of silence were marked by struggle and secrecy, a complex interplay of guilt, addiction, and mental health challenges. The repercussions of the crime extended beyond the immediate tragedy, shaping her life and those around her in lasting ways. As the silence broke, the truth emerged with undeniable force. The path toward accountability was fraught with difficulty but necessary for healing. Christine's story was entering a new and painful chapter, one that demanded confrontation with the past and its consequences. In 2006, after nearly 3 years of stagnant investigation and dead-end leads, the case that had haunted the community of Clear Lake suddenly took a dramatic turn. An anonymous tip arrived at the police station, shaking the foundation of the cold case and reigniting hope for closure. The tipster claimed that Christine had confessed her participation in the brutal killings alongside Christopher Snider. This revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation, compelling the authorities to act swiftly and decisively. For years, the murders had remained an enigma. The victims, Tiffany Rowell, Rachel, Marcus Priscilla, and Adalbert Sanchez, had been taken in a violent crime that left a community reeling. Despite tireless work from investigators, leads dried up, and the case became one of many unsolved files. The families of the victims were left in painful limbo, grappling with grief and unanswered questions. But with this new tip, the cold case was brought back to the forefront. Immediately, investigators began re-examining the evidence collected from the crime scenes. Bullet casings, forensic samples, and witness statements were analyzed with fresh eyes, searching for details that might have been overlooked. Advances in forensic technology since 2003 also offered new possibilities. DNA testing methods had improved, and ballistics analysis was more precise. The hope was that these tools could finally yield conclusive results that tied suspects to the crime. Meanwhile, the police turned their attention to Christopher Snider, who was already in custody on unrelated charges. He had become a person of interest due to his connection with Christine and the suspicions surrounding their relationship. Officers sought to interview him extensively about the murders, hoping he might provide information that would unravel the mystery. However, before these plans could fully materialize, tragedy struck. Snider took his own life in a motel room while in police custody. His suicide was a significant blow to the investigation. With him gone, a critical source of potential evidence and testimony vanished. The exact reasons for his suicide remained speculative, but it left law enforcement scrambling to redirect their efforts. Without Snider's testimony or cooperation, investigators shifted their focus entirely onto Christine. She became the prime suspect. The police began intensively interrogating those close to her during the time of the murders, piecing together a timeline of her actions and relationships. Friends, family, and acquaintances were questioned to reveal any suspicious behavior or motives. Christine's life, already burdened by past trauma and secrecy, came under a microscope. The renewed investigation put her under immense pressure. Her mental health, fragile after years of struggle, deteriorated further. The weight of suspicion and the looming prospect of charges created a difficult psychological environment. During interviews, some acquaintances described Christine as deeply affected by the events, fearful, and possibly manipulated by Snider. Others recalled moments of anger or secrecy, suggesting that her involvement might have been more significant than previously believed. These mixed accounts complicated the investigation, making it harder to separate fact from perception. Forensic reanalysis played a pivotal role. New technologies allowed the testing of evidence with greater accuracy. Investigators hoped to find fingerprints, DNA, or ballistic matches linking Christine to the crime scene or weapons used. These scientific methods added weight to the circumstantial evidence gathered through witness testimony. As the community watched the developments unfold, public interest surged. Media outlets covered the story extensively, bringing renewed scrutiny to Christine's life. The families of the victims expressed cautious optimism, holding on to the hope that justice was finally within reach. Christine's legal situation became increasingly precarious. Without Snider to share or deflect blame, the prosecution aimed to build a strong case against her alone. The evidence gathered through the renewed investigation formed the foundation of their strategy. Her defense team prepared to challenge the reliability of the anonymous tip and the circumstances surrounding Snider's death. The upcoming trial promised to be emotionally charged and complex. It was a pivotal moment not only for Christine but for the entire community seeking closure. The trial would determine whether the years of silence and secrecy would finally give way to truth and justice. As the investigation progressed, Christine's daily life grew increasingly restricted. Surveillance, police interviews, and media attention disrupted any semblance of normality. The stress exacerbated her mental health challenges, making the journey ahead even more daunting. Despite these hardships, the break in the case marked a crucial turning point. It transformed a stagnant investigation into an active pursuit of justice. The anonymous tip was the catalyst that breathed new life into the search for truth, ultimately pushing the case closer to resolution. For the families of the victims, this development was bittersweet. It reopened old wounds while offering hope for accountability. Their resilience and unwavering desire for justice kept the pressure on authorities to follow through. The break in the case demonstrated the importance of perseverance in criminal investigations. Sometimes answers emerge after years of silence, changing the course of lives forever. Christine's story was entering a new phase, one that would expose hidden truths and demand reckoning. In July 2006, after years of mounting suspicion and a slow, painstaking investigation, the police finally arrested Christine. The once quiet, unassuming girl from Clear Lake had become the center of one of the most shocking criminal cases the community had ever seen. The news spread quickly. Christine, who had once been a victim of bullying and shyness, was now accused of being involved in a quadruple homicide. The community struggled to come to terms with the startling transformation of someone they thought they knew. At the police station, Christine was placed under intense questioning. Initially, she denied any involvement in the murders, refusing to admit she had played any role. She maintained that she was innocent and had no part in the violence that had taken the lives of 4 people. The detectives, however, were not convinced by her denials. They had evidence to support their suspicions and knew that breaking through her silence would be crucial to the case. The interrogation was long and exhausting. Officers employed various tactics, attempting to unravel the truth from Christine's guarded responses. As the hours passed, her defenses began to falter. The combination of pressure, evidence, and the psychological weight of the situation made it difficult for her to maintain her denials. Eventually, Christine agreed to give a formal statement. In this statement, Christine admitted that she had been at the scene of the murders. She described being present during the attack but denied having pulled the trigger. Instead, she claimed that Christopher Snider had been the shooter. According to her, Snider was the one responsible for the killings, and she had never intended for anyone to die. She painted herself as an unwilling participant caught in a terrifying situation beyond her control. This confession sent shockwaves through the investigation and the community alike. On the surface, Christine's admission seemed to explain her connection to the crime while casting her in a less culpable role. However, law enforcement remained skeptical. They continued to scrutinize her story, comparing it against physical evidence and eyewitness accounts. As the investigators dug deeper, inconsistencies began to emerge. Some elements of Christine's statement did not align with the forensic evidence collected at the crime scenes. For example, ballistic reports suggested multiple shooters or a different sequence of events than what she described. Witness statements also conflicted with parts of her narrative, raising questions about her credibility. The police started to suspect that Christine's involvement might have been more active than she claimed. The idea that she was simply a bystander or coerced into participation became increasingly unlikely. Instead, they believed she had taken an active role in the murders, perhaps even helping to plan or carry out parts of the crime. This shift in understanding changed the trajectory of the case. The authorities began treating Christine as a principal suspect, not just a witness or accessory. The community was stunned. How could the shy, bullied girl, who had once been known for her quiet demeanor and later her transformation into a beauty queen, be accused of such a heinous crime? As the news spread, reactions were mixed. Some were incredulous, refusing to believe that Christine could be involved. Others were shocked but accepted the harsh reality presented by the investigation. The contrast between the girl they knew and the accused criminal was stark, fueling rumors and speculation. Meanwhile, Christine's demeanor changed dramatically. The pressure of the arrest, coupled with the reality of the charges, weighed heavily on her. The confident, composed front she had maintained began to crack, revealing the strain beneath. Her mental and emotional state was fragile, grappling with guilt, fear, and the looming consequences. As the investigation progressed, the police meticulously cross-checked Christine's confession with the forensic data. The crime scene revealed evidence that suggested a more direct involvement than she had admitted. Bullet casings, fingerprints, and DNA samples did not support her claim of merely being present. Instead, these pieces pointed to a level of participation that went beyond a passive role. Witnesses who had been hesitant to speak before now began to provide clearer accounts. Some described seeing Christine behaving aggressively during the incident. Others mentioned hearing her voice giving commands or encouragement. These testimonies undermined her version of events and made the prosecution's case stronger. Despite the mounting evidence, Christine's defense team argued that her confession was coerced under pressure and stress. They painted a picture of a vulnerable young woman overwhelmed by fear and confusion, manipulated by Snider and circumstance. They insisted that she was not the mastermind or the shooter, but a scared teenager caught in a tragic situation. The community followed every development closely. The media coverage intensified, portraying Christine's transformation from a shy girl to a beauty queen to a murder suspect as a shocking saga. This narrative captivated the public and sparked debates about crime, youth, and accountability. For the families of the victims, Christine's confession was a bitter pill. It confirmed that the person they thought they knew had been involved in the horror that shattered their lives. Their desire for justice grew even stronger, fueling calls for a thorough and transparent trial. As Christine awaited trial, her life was confined and scrutinized. The arrest had stripped away any semblance of normalcy. She faced the reality of a criminal justice system that would dissect her past and hold her accountable for actions that forever altered many lives. The arrest and confession marked a turning point in the long saga of the murders. After years of silence, the truth had finally begun to surface, though it came wrapped in layers of complexity and contradiction. The community braced itself for the legal battle ahead, hoping that justice would finally be served. In early 2008, the trial of Christine began, marking a critical moment in a case that had captured the attention of the entire community. After years of investigation, conflicting statements, and emotional turmoil, the courtroom was set to become the stage where truth, justice, and accountability would be fiercely contested. The air inside the courthouse was thick with anticipation, as families of the victims, local residents, and media personnel gathered to witness the proceedings. The prosecution took an aggressive stance from the start. They painted Christine not as a frightened teenager, but as a willing and active participant in the brutal murders. Their narrative was one of jealousy and resentment, fueled by a toxic relationship with Christopher Snider. According to the prosecution, Christine was not a passive bystander but an accomplice who played a direct role in the killings. Central to the prosecution's case was the ballistic evidence collected from the crime scenes. Experts testified about the trajectories of the bullets, the types of weapons used, and how the physical evidence aligned with the theory of multiple shooters or coordinated actions. They pointed to inconsistencies in Christine's earlier accounts, using forensic science to dismantle her claim that Snider was solely responsible. Witness testimonies added further weight to the prosecution's argument. Several individuals recounted moments where Christine appeared to be involved in aggressive or controlling behavior during the events. These accounts contrasted starkly with the image of a scared, manipulated girl and instead suggested active participation. The prosecution carefully wove these stories together to create a compelling picture of Christine's role. Moreover, the prosecution used Christine's own words against her. Her various statements, confessions, and inconsistencies were scrutinized in detail. The shifting nature of her story, from denial to partial admission, was presented as evidence of guilt and an attempt to evade full responsibility. The prosecution argued that her changing narrative undermined her credibility and indicated deception. The defense team faced the daunting challenge of countering this narrative. They portrayed Snider as the mastermind behind the murders, asserting that he was the manipulative force who coerced Christine into involvement. The defense emphasized her youth, vulnerability, and fear, arguing that Christine acted out of self-preservation rather than malice. They presented psychological evaluations and testimony to support the claim that Christine was under significant emotional and psychological distress. Her history of bullying, mental health struggles, and drug dependency were highlighted to provide context for her actions. The defense sought to elicit sympathy from the jury by framing Christine as a victim of circumstance. Despite these efforts, the defense struggled to overcome the damage to Christine's credibility. The brutal nature of the crime, combined with her inconsistent statements, made it difficult for the jury to fully accept the portrayal of her as a coerced participant. The prosecution's evidence appeared solid and persuasive, casting a long shadow over her defense. The trial attracted intense media attention. Reporters and cameras filled the courtroom, broadcasting every detail to an eager public. The story of Christine's transformation, from a shy, bullied girl to a beauty queen, and finally to an accused murderer, captivated audiences and fueled widespread debate. Media outlets dissected every aspect of the case, influencing public opinion and heightening the trial's emotional atmosphere. The courtroom itself was often packed with victims' family members, who sat in somber rows, their faces etched with grief and hope. Spectators filled every available seat, some drawn by curiosity, others by a desire to witness justice unfold. The tension was palpable as each day brought new testimony, evidence, and dramatic moments. As the trial progressed, both sides presented expert witnesses, forensic specialists, and psychologists. Each testimony added layers of complexity, challenging jurors to weigh technical evidence against human emotion and personal narratives. The case was not just about facts and figures, but about understanding motives, character, and the nature of complicity. The prosecution and defense battled fiercely over key pieces of evidence. Ballistics reports, witness accounts, and psychological profiles became focal points. The jury was tasked with navigating through conflicting stories, scientific data, and emotional appeals to reach a verdict that would resonate beyond the courtroom walls. As the trial moved forward, the courtroom drama intensified. Prosecutors meticulously detailed the timeline of the murders, painting a chilling picture of premeditation and coordinated violence. They argued that Christine's jealousy and resentment, compounded by the toxic influence of Snider, had driven her to actively participate in the killings. The prosecution emphasized that the brutality of the crime could not be attributed solely to Snider's actions. Christine's defense team continued to push back, attempting to humanize her for the jury. They portrayed her as a young woman overwhelmed by fear and manipulation, caught in a situation beyond her control. They argued that Snider was the real culprit, the mastermind who coerced Christine into being an unwilling accomplice. The defense called on psychological experts to testify about trauma bonding and coercive control, highlighting how victims can become trapped in abusive relationships. Despite these arguments, the inconsistencies in Christine's statements weighed heavily against her. The prosecution used her changing accounts to suggest deception and an attempt to shift blame. Several witnesses also testified that Christine had exhibited controlling and aggressive behavior during the incident, further undermining the defense's portrayal of her as merely a victim. The jury was presented with graphic details of the murders, including evidence of the victim's struggle and the violence inflicted upon them. The emotional weight of these revelations added a somber tone to the proceedings, reminding everyone present of the human cost behind the case. Media coverage remained intense throughout the trial. News outlets provided daily updates and public interest reached a fever pitch. Social media buzzed with opinions and speculation, often polarized between sympathy for Christine and condemnation. The case sparked discussions about youth crime, the psychology of manipulation, and the complexities of guilt and innocence. For the families of the victims, the trial was both a source of hope and anguish. Each piece of testimony brought them closer to answers but also forced them to relive the trauma of their loss. Their presence in the courtroom was a testament to their resilience and determination to see justice served. After weeks of testimony, closing arguments began. The prosecution urged the jury to consider the totality of the evidence and Christine's own words, concluding that she was guilty of participating in the murders. The defense called for understanding and leniency, emphasizing Christine's youth, vulnerability, and the influence Snider had over her. Ultimately, the jury faced a difficult decision. Weighing complex evidence, emotional testimony, and competing narratives, they were tasked with delivering a verdict that would determine Christine's fate. The trial of Christine marked a profound chapter in a tragic story. It revealed the depths of human complexity, the consequences of toxic relationships, and the pursuit of justice in the face of pain and loss. Whatever the verdict, the community knew that the echoes of the case would linger for years to come. The courtroom was tense as the final phase of Christine Paolilla's trial approached, the moment that would determine her fate and bring years of anguish to a potential close. After months of investigation, months of grueling testimony, and weeks of intense legal battle, the responsibility now fell upon the jury to deliver their verdict. The weight of their decision was immense. It would not only decide Christine's future but also offer some measure of justice for the families devastated by the brutal murders. As the jury retired to deliberate, the atmosphere inside the courthouse was heavy with anticipation and unease. The community had been watching the trial closely, with emotions running high. News outlets lined the halls, broadcasting every development to a public hungry for answers. Friends, neighbors, and strangers alike found themselves engrossed in the story of a shy young woman whose life had been irrevocably changed, and who was now accused of participating in a horrific crime. The jurors faced a complex case. They had been presented with a tangled web of evidence. Ballistic reports that detailed the mechanics of the shooting, witness testimonies that varied in perspective and tone, and psychological evaluations that offered insights into Christine's state of mind. They had heard the prosecution's portrayal of her as an active participant, motivated by jealousy and resentment, and driven by a toxic relationship with Christopher Snider. The defense, on the other hand, urged them to consider the possibility that Christine was a scared teenager, manipulated and coerced by a dangerous partner. The jury deliberated carefully. They spent hours sifting through the facts and testimonies, discussing every detail and weighing the credibility of witnesses. Some jurors expressed sympathy for Christine's troubled background and questioned whether she had truly acted of her own volition. Others focused on the brutal nature of the crime and the evidence linking her to the scene, feeling the gravity of the loss suffered by the victims' families. As the days passed, tensions grew both inside and outside the courtroom. The families of Tiffany Rowell, Rachel, Marcus Priscilla, and Adalbert Sanchez attended every session, their grief palpable. For them, the trial was not just a legal proceeding, it was a painful reckoning with a tragedy that had shattered their lives. Each piece of evidence, each witness's words, brought fresh waves of sorrow but also a sliver of hope that justice might finally be served. The defense continued to emphasize Christine's youth and vulnerability. They pointed to her history of bullying, her struggles with mental health, and the influence Snider had over her. They argued that she was a victim in her own right, someone trapped in a dangerous dynamic and lacking the maturity or strength to resist. Their aim was to humanize her before the jury, to remind them that behind the charges was a young woman still capable of change. In contrast, the prosecution laid bare the cold facts of the case. They reminded the jury of the brutality inflicted on the victims, the calculated nature of the attack, and Christine's shifting stories. They highlighted the forensic evidence that contradicted her claims of innocence, painting a picture of a person who had chosen violence, whether willingly or not. Their goal was to convince the jury that the law must hold her accountable, regardless of her age or circumstances. As the jury prepared to announce their decision, the courtroom was packed with spectators. Reporters jostled for position, family members sat quietly with grim resolve, and members of the community waited with bated breath. The judge reminded everyone of the seriousness of the moment and the need for decorum. When the jury returned, the foreperson stood and delivered the verdict. Christine Paolilla was found guilty on all 4 counts of capital murder. The announcement echoed through the courtroom, eliciting reactions of shock, relief, and sorrow from those present. For many, the verdict was a confirmation of the truth they had hoped to hear. For others, it was a heartbreaking conclusion to a tragic story. Christine herself remained stoic, showing little visible emotion as the verdict was read. At just 22 years old, the weight of the decision hung heavy in the air. The judge proceeded to sentencing, a somber ceremony marked by gravity and silence. Christine was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 40 years, a sentence reflecting both the severity of the crimes and the consideration of her youth. The courtroom was filled with a mix of reactions. The victims' families expressed relief that justice had been served, but also the painful acknowledgement that no verdict could undo their loss. Friends and community members struggled to reconcile the Christine they had known with the one convicted of such a grave offense. The media described the sentence as a decisive end to a case that had captured the nation's attention. Outside the courthouse, emotions ran high. Vigils were held in memory of the victims, and discussions about crime, punishment, and rehabilitation sparked heated debates. The case became a symbol of the challenges inherent in the criminal justice system, balancing accountability with compassion, punishment with understanding. For Christine, the sentence marked the beginning of a new chapter, one defined by incarceration, reflection, and the long, uncertain road ahead. The possibility of parole offered a faint hope of future freedom, but it was tempered by the recognition of the gravity of her actions and the years she would spend behind bars. The verdict and sentence closed a painful chapter for many but left lingering questions about youth, culpability, and the potential for redemption. The community would continue to grapple with the impact of the crimes, honoring the memories of those lost while seeking ways to prevent similar tragedies. In the days following the verdict, the weight of the decision settled heavily on everyone involved. Christine's life was irrevocably changed. Though sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 40 years, the reality of spending decades behind bars loomed large. The prison system would become her new world, a place starkly different from the one she had known before the tragedy. Christine's mental and emotional state during this period was fragile. The years leading up to the arrest had taken a toll on her, and the trial's outcome intensified the isolation and uncertainty she faced. The transition to prison life posed new challenges: separation from family, loss of freedom, and the harsh realities of confinement. Meanwhile, the families of the victims began their own difficult journey toward healing. While the verdict brought some solace, it could never replace the lives they had lost. Each day was a reminder of their absence, and the memory of the murders remained etched deeply in their hearts. They channeled their grief into advocacy, seeking to raise awareness about the consequences of violence and the importance of justice. The community, too, was left grappling with the aftermath. The case had exposed deep wounds and complex issues surrounding youth crime, manipulation, and accountability. Conversations about prevention, mental health support, and intervention gained urgency as residents reflected on how such a tragedy could have been averted. Legal experts weighed in on the sentencing, noting its balance between punishment and potential rehabilitation. The possibility of parole, though distant, was seen as a recognition that even those who commit serious crimes as young adults may one day have the chance to reintegrate into society, provided they demonstrate genuine remorse and reform. Christine's defense team indicated plans to pursue appeals, citing concerns about procedural errors and the handling of evidence during the trial. The legal battle, therefore, was not entirely over. Yet, the verdict stood as a powerful affirmation of the justice system's role in addressing violent crime and delivering consequences. For many, the case of Christine Paolilla served as a stark reminder of the fragility of youth and the devastating impact of toxic relationships. It highlighted the need for vigilance, support, and intervention to prevent vulnerable individuals from spiraling into darkness. As years passed, Christine's name faded from public headlines, but the echoes of the case continued to resonate. The memories of the victims remained alive through the efforts of their families and advocates, who worked tirelessly to honor their legacies. In the end, the verdict and sentence were more than legal conclusions. They were a testament to the enduring quest for justice amidst tragedy, and a call to address the underlying factors that lead to such heartbreaking outcomes. Christine's life after sentencing was a dramatic departure from everything she had known before. Once a high school student with dreams and plans for the future, she was now confined within the harsh walls of a Texas correctional facility. The stark contrast between her past and present was undeniable. Prison became her new reality, a place marked by routine, isolation, and constant reflection on the events that led her here. Within the prison system, Christine faced the challenges common to many incarcerated individuals, but her case drew added scrutiny. Because of the high-profile nature of her trial, she was often a subject of attention among inmates and staff alike. The notoriety complicated her experience, as some viewed her with suspicion or resentment, while others recognized the complicated circumstances surrounding her conviction. Over time, Christine participated in rehabilitation programs aimed at addressing her mental health issues and preparing her for life after prison. These programs included counseling for trauma, substance abuse treatment, and educational courses. However, the path to personal growth was fraught with difficulties. The weight of guilt, loss, and public judgment lingered heavily, making emotional recovery a slow and painful process. From time to time, Christine agreed to give interviews, hoping to share her perspective and perhaps reclaim some control over her narrative. In these rare moments, she portrayed herself as a victim of manipulation, trapped in a toxic relationship with Christopher Snider that had spiraled out of control. She expressed remorse for the victims and their families but maintained that her actions were influenced heavily by coercion and fear. Public opinion regarding these statements remained deeply divided. Some viewed her as a cautionary example of a troubled youth undone by bad choices and bad influences, capable of reform and deserving of empathy. Others remained skeptical, believing her narrative to be a convenient attempt to deflect full responsibility for a heinous crime. The case, in many ways, became a prism through which broader debates about crime, punishment, and rehabilitation were reflected. Outside the prison walls, the story of Christine Paolilla continued to capture the attention of true crime enthusiasts. Podcasts, documentaries, and books explored the layers of the case, the psychological complexities, the toxic dynamics of her relationship with Snider, and the tragic consequences of betrayal and violence. It became a subject of fascination for those drawn to the dark intersections of innocence lost and deadly secrets hidden beneath everyday lives. For many, Christine's story served as a chilling reminder of how quickly the veneer of normalcy can fracture. A girl once described as shy and bullied transformed into someone capable of unimaginable violence. A transformation fueled by jealousy, manipulation, and a profound breakdown of trust. The case underscored how appearances can deceive and how the people we least suspect may carry the darkest secrets. At the same time, the case raised important questions about the criminal justice system's approach to young offenders involved in serious crimes. Christine's youth, background, and psychological state were factors considered during her trial and sentencing, but the line between accountability and compassion remained a subject of ongoing debate. Families affected by the tragedy continued their efforts to promote healing and awareness. Many became advocates for victims' rights, speaking publicly about their experiences and pushing for reforms aimed at preventing similar crimes. Their voices added depth and humanity to a story often reduced to headlines and statistics. The legacy of the case extended beyond individual punishment. It sparked discussions about early intervention, mental health support, and the need for community awareness to identify and address toxic relationships before they escalate to violence. It highlighted the importance of understanding the complexities behind crime, rather than viewing offenders solely through the lens of guilt. As Christine settled into the routine of prison life, the outside world continued to wrestle with the echoes of her story. For some, it was a grim cautionary tale. For others, a tragic example of lost potential and systemic failure. Either way, the impact of the case was lasting, its lessons lingering long after the trial ended. Inside the prison walls, Christine's days followed a strict routine. Wake up, meals, work assignments, counseling sessions, and limited recreation. The monotony was punctuated by moments of reflection and, at times, deep remorse. Being cut off from the outside world, especially from her family, weighed heavily on her psyche. Letters and visits were sparse, reminders of the life she had lost and the uncertain future ahead. Despite the harsh realities, Christine sought to find meaning and purpose within her confinement. She immersed herself in educational programs, earning her GED and later enrolling in vocational training. These efforts were part of her attempt to rebuild a sense of self-worth and hope, even as she faced the enormity of her sentence. Rehabilitation was a constant challenge, complicated by the stigma of her conviction and the complex emotions tied to her past actions. Psychological support played a crucial role in Christine's adaptation. Regular sessions with prison counselors helped her confront the trauma, guilt, and anger that simmered beneath the surface. Therapy focused on recognizing patterns of toxic relationships and developing healthier coping mechanisms, aiming to prepare her for eventual reintegration into society, if that day ever came. Outside prison, the legacy of Christine's case continued to reverberate. True crime communities dissected every facet, analyzing her transformation from victim to perpetrator, and debating the nature of justice and mercy. The story became a reference point in discussions about how young people become involved in violent crimes, especially when influenced by manipulation and abuse. Meanwhile, the victims' families worked tirelessly to honor the memory of their loved ones. Memorials and scholarships were established, aiming to keep their spirits alive and inspire positive change. They also advocated for better support systems for at-risk youth and more effective interventions to prevent cycles of violence. The case sparked broader societal conversations about the complexity of criminal behavior. It challenged simplistic narratives and forced an examination of factors like mental health, coercion, and the impact of childhood trauma. It also highlighted the limitations of the justice system in addressing these nuances, fueling calls for reform and more holistic approaches. For Christine, the years ahead remained uncertain. The possibility of parole loomed far in the future, contingent on her behavior, rehabilitation progress, and the evolving attitudes of parole boards. Her journey was a testament to the long shadows cast by a single moment of violence, shadows that would shape not only her life but the lives of many around her. In the end, the story of Christine Paolilla was a powerful, sobering lesson about the fragility of innocence and the destructive power of toxic relationships. It reminded society of the importance of vigilance, support, and compassion to prevent such tragedies. Though her name might one day fade from headlines, the echoes of her case would continue to influence conversations about crime, punishment, and redemption for years to come.